All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Armchair Travel to Chios, Greece with the Traveling Librarian. Join Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian, for his newest armchair travel presentation. This series highlights travel photography and stories and travel tips about destinations around the world. This month, travel to Chios, an island in the eastern Aegean, which captivates with its diverse landscapes and rich history. Famous for its medieval villages, fragrant citrus orchards, and serene beaches, it offers a blend of cultural heritage and natural beauty. The island is renowned for its unique mastic gum cultivation, a tradition dating back to ancient times. Visitors can explore UNESCO listed
UNESCO.
monasteries and castles and enjoy local delicacies like mastiha-flavored sweets. I'm just butchering all this, Jeff. I
Don't
should
even
have
try.
practiced
I'll
better.
take care of it.
I was just making sure the Zoom would start. So Jeff is the recently retired head of reference services at the Beebe Library in Wakefield, and he's an avid traveler and photographer. And I again want to thank the Friends of the Library and the Corning Life Sciences Foundation for being the primary sponsor for this summer's armchair travel series. So it's a mouthful. All right, so all 100 plus of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeff for joining us this morning. And Jeff, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. And thanks for having me back again. Thanks for joining me, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started right away. Hope that looks good. Um, you might be sick of me going to Greece, but that's what I tend to do a lot. And I hope you'll enjoy this because it's a little bit off the beaten track. And I do apologize for those of you well, particularly those of us in Massachusetts who are suffering through a heat wave, because it would be nicer, I suppose, if I were taking you somewhere like Iceland or Norway, somewhere nice and cool right now, because Greece is hot. And so where I'm taking you is actually extremely hot right now. But at least it's virtual. So we'll get started right now, and I'm going to show you a map. Um, as Robert said, feel free to put any of your questions in either the chat or the Q&A, and I'll try and answer them as we go along. Um, to put Chios on the map first, let's take a quick look at what the island groupings in Greece are, because I think it's good to kind of get the lay of the land. Greece has over 6,000 islands. Only about 200 of them are actually inhabited. I've been to about 16 or 17 islands at this point, so I've got quite a long ways to go to visit all of them. But I do want to talk about the different island groups so you have an idea of how they're organized. The best known ones, the ones that you would see on the cover of any travel guidebook to Greece, are the orange ones here in the middle. These are the Cyclades, and they're so called because they form a circle around the sacred island of Delos. Those are the ones with the whitewashed houses and the little churches with the blue domes. But Greece has many other island groups as well that have different architectural styles and different foods and so forth. But if you ever see a picture of Greece, chances are it's one of the Cyclades that you're looking at. But the other groups, the little red ones here very close to where Athens is, are called the Saronic Islands. Those are because they're in the Saronic Bay. The green ones over on the side toward Italy on the west coast are the Ionian Islands because they're in the Ionian Sea. The yellow ones down here are called the Dodekanissos. Dodeca means 12 because there are 12 main islands in that group. The best known one is Rhodes. And in fact, later on this summer, I believe somewhere towards the end of August, I'm doing another program on Rhodes and Simi, which is an island just next to it. Up here, the little pale blue ones, these are definitely off the beaten track. Very few people go here. These are the northern Sporades Islands. And the purple ones are considered the northern Aegean Islands, and that's the group to which Chios belongs. Chios is right here. To see it a little bit more geographically, you can see how mountainous Greece is here. Chios, again, way over here by the Turkish coast, is the fifth largest island by size in Greece. It's about 325 square miles, and it's about sixth in population for the Greek islands. However, there's about 50,000 people there. Um, but what's interesting is, as big as it is, it's very untouristed compared to the other islands. In fact, it's not even in the top 15 islands for tourism. Here's a little bit clearer view where you can very distinctly see the outline and see how close it is to Turkey. To the Turkish coast is only a couple of kilometers. Like most of Greece, Chios was under the thumb of the ancient Ionians and under Alexander the Great. It was under the Romans, it was under the Byzantines, and probably most importantly in its history, it was under the Genoese from Italy for about 2.5 centuries, from roughly 1300 to the mid 1500s. And then after that, it was the Ottomans. Both of those empires exploited the riches of the island, primarily the mastic crop, which we're going to talk about in more detail later. And then in 1822, during the Greek War of Independence from the Ottomans, the Chians rebelled along with people elsewhere in Greece. And probably the single most important historical event in the island's history is that the Ottomans massacred or enslaved about 80% of the total population of the island, which was actually considerably larger than it is today. About 20,000 people escaped the tragedy as refugees. It was a major turning point in the war because it actually was news widespread through the Western world, even into America, and it really galvanized Western opposition to the Ottomans in Greece. Uh, Unfortunately, not only did that happen, but about 60 years later, in 1881, there was a really bad earthquake which killed thousands more people. And Chios never really, after that, recovered its historical glory. So nowadays, it's more of a sleepy island. It's got wonderful variety, but relatively few tourists. So I think it's a great place to go because if you like history, it has scenic villages, it has beautiful coastal scenery, it has great hikes, um, beautiful beaches, lots of nice day trips. There are ancient castles to see, and delicious food. And if you go there, you're going to experience all of that, but without all of the tourism and crowds that you can get on a lot of the other islands. Of course, the other thing that you will see in abundance is cats. They're everywhere in Greece. Here's a close-up of the island. You can see how mountainous it is, like most of the islands in Greece. And the little red lines show you where we went on our travels. We had a rental car, and we were there in November, which was a very good time to travel in Greece, anywhere in the Mediterranean. And as you can see, we explored most of the island. We were there for about 5 full days, which is enough to see the main sites of the island. You could see most of them in 2 or 3 days, or you could spend even longer and enjoy the beaches and kind of relax. But 5 days was a nice time, I think, to see everything we wanted to see. You really probably do want to rent a car just because public transit, it exists on the island, but the buses are very slow. So unless you have tons and tons of time, a car is definitely a better way to get around and to explore the places you want to go. We stayed very close to the main town, which is on the western coast, facing Turkey, in an area called Campos. And we stayed in the Riziko estate, which is shown here. They don't know exactly when this estate was built, probably in the 18th century. And this is just south of the capital town of the island, and also very close to the airport. It's only about 10 minutes away from the airport. And this whole area was developed by the Genoese in the 13th century for citrus groves, which still exist. There's a lot of citrus groves in this whole neighborhood. The roads are extremely narrow. You can see we had a tiny little Hyundai rent-a-car, and you can see how it barely fits on the road, particularly since next to it is a gully where it drops off with no railing for about 6 or 8 feet. Particularly at night, it's difficult to drive around. But it's a beautiful neighborhood to stay in because it's centrally located in the island. It's close to the main town without being in the middle of it. And where we stayed was one of the typical of the many restored estates that they have in this area. Beautiful stone, local stone, towers, elegant building compounds with gardens, many of which still have working citrus groves. A lot of the houses are private still, but many of them have been turned into hotels or guest houses. Um, and ours had beautiful outdoor spaces with gardens to sit in and shaded orange groves. You could eat your breakfast outside. Our place had a wonderful homemade breakfast buffet with all kinds of choices and Greek things to eat. And as a connection to its history, it even had the original well and water wheel, which would have been used to irrigate the orange groves around the property. And it's a delightful neighborhood to walk around. The Fortunately, the traffic is minimal, even though the streets are very narrow. But you can kind of stroll around and peek through the gates at the many elaborate homes and villas, most of which I think come from like the between the 16th and 18th centuries. Here's a little local shrine along the side of the road. Looking back at our place across a little gully, which was dry for the entire time we were there. We were there in November, in case you're wondering. I think I said that. This is looking across the bridge back to our place. Um, and what looks like a patio, this is actually the road, but it has a giant tree in the middle of it that you have to kind of negotiate when you're driving. But as you stroll around the neighborhood, you'll see beautiful gates and walls using the multicolored local stone. And if you're lucky, you can peek in through and see some of the private gardens. Most of the guidebooks to Chios have nice walking tours, which will help you explore and point out the most impressive estates. But it's kind of fun just to stroll around by yourself and stumble serendipitously upon different beautiful houses. I noticed someone in the chat asked if I went with a travel group, and I did not. I almost always travel independently, so I just booked my own accommodations and rented a car and explored on my own. But there are definitely Greece is one of the most touristed countries on earth. So if you're looking for tours, there are definitely different opportunities that you can look for. Big tours, small tours, boat tours, and so forth. Um, Chios being a little bit off the beaten track may not have as many as other places, but if you do some internet searching, I'm sure you can find something. There are also places that will organize private tours if you want, if there's a particular place you want to go. But Chios is a very easy place to travel. There's limited traffic. It's a very relaxed place. So I think you could easily travel there on your own. People often ask me about language because not very many people speak Greek. But uh, most Greeks speak, particularly in touristed areas, speak at least some English. So while it's worthwhile to learn a few basic phrases in Greek, hello, goodbye, thank you, please, where is, all that kind of stuff, you certainly don't need to learn Greek. Most people will speak more than enough English to be able to help you get by. Um, oh yes, no. Someone asked. I keep saying we. Yes, I just traveled with my husband. We tend to uh, poke around Greece on our own, so it was just the two of us. But no, the we did not refer to a group. So just some more shots of the area around where we stayed. Beautiful mansions, most of which are kind of in the style of the neoclassical style. Some of these were actually built after the earthquake, which is why they have a more modern look to them. Right across the street from, or across the bridge from where we stayed, is this lovely church called Panagia Syriotisa, which had a very typical style Chios belfry that has this sort of open stonework. And the inside had an incredibly elaborate interior. Of course, like all of Greece, Chios is overwhelmingly Greek Orthodox. So roughly 80 to 90% of the population is Greek Orthodox. So that's most of the churches that you see will be that. Although the closer you get to the Turkish side, the northern and eastern parts of Greece, you will definitely see mosques. If they are no longer in use, they may be historic mosques back from when it was part of the Ottoman Empire. But the architecture and the style and even the food starts to lean a little bit more Turkish because it has much more influence on that side of the country. This is the main capital of the city, which is about 25,000 people maybe, and therefore is about half the size of the entire island population. It's not an amazing place. Of all the historic towns that I've been to on Greek islands, Chios town is, I wouldn't put it at the top, but it's very pleasant and it has a nice waterfront promenade. And it has some interesting historic sites to see because the Byzantines and the Genoese fortified the town. That those ruins still exist. You can see here the big walls that surround the historic part of the town. You can stroll around the castle walls, and within you'll see a lot of Ottoman influence through the old mosque buildings. There's a Muslim cemetery that you can see here. And a lot of the architecture, as I said, particularly the style of the older buildings, those that didn't miraculously did not get destroyed by the earthquake in the 19th century, is still a very Eastern looking style, particularly with these bay windows that jut out over the street to provide more air circulation in the hot months. There's a nice museum that's part of the castle complex, which is an old Ottoman Turkish bath complex, which is now a museum. Very nicely done with a beautifully restored interior. These are actually the old restrooms. So even back in the day, they had, of course, they were Turkish toilets, but at least they were indoors. And it's fun to stroll around the old city because there's a lot of nice little alleyways, old streets, beautiful architecture. The building on the right is actually the office of the archaeological ministry that manages archaeological sites on the island. As with most Greek islands, there's a lot of seafood, and fishing is a major industry. So there are fish restaurants all over the island and places selling fish particularly early in the mornings. But I'm going to take you on a tour around the island and show you the various sites to see. A very short way up the coast, just a few miles up from the city, the main town, are some historic windmills that have been restored, but they date back centuries, and they're very atmospheric, right at the side of the ocean. And there are churches all over the island as well. This particular one I wanted to stop and see mainly because of the stunning pebble mosaic terraces that you can see here, all around the outside of the main church building. They're among the biggest I've ever seen in Greece. They're particularly popular. It's called Votsalota, which means like pebble design, essentially. And it's quite an art form in the Aegean, mostly in the far eastern Aegean, so the Dodecanese Islands and the islands as further to the east. It's more popular there. And it's very intricate design, sometimes geometric, sometimes with images of animals, birds, plants, and so forth, done entirely with either black and white stones. It's extremely time consuming and very expensive to do. These are more historic than recent, but even newer homes, people will pay to have this kind of thing done on their terraces. This is one of the bigger churches in the area. and it's one of the oldest churches on the island to survive the old earthquake. But it actually wasn't until after that in the 1890s that they put in these incredible um, stone designs. Just I can't even imagine how many square meters there are of them, but they completely surround the entire church building. Behind it is this beautiful little chapel and mausoleum. The particular village that this church is located in, it's kind of a suburb, northern suburb of the main town. It's known for its what they call a rocket war, which every Easter, as part of the Easter celebrations, the churches in the town fire thousands of fireworks at each other at the churches. This is what Greeks do for fun. The idea is to try to hit the bell tower of the opposing church. What this has to do with the resurrection of Christ, I don't know, but it's a lot of fun. And I've noticed a lot of Southern European cultures love to explode things. So this is what they do on Easter. And this town is particularly known for it. Fortunately, when we were there were no explosions. It was very peaceful. In the same neck of the woods is this rock, not very impressive, but it has an important historic connection. It's called the Daskalopetra, which means teacher's rock. Originally, it was probably a shrine to the goddess Kiveli, who was an Anatolian goddess from what is now Turkey, probably from around the 6th century BC. It has later been connected with Homer, the ancient poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey, because Chios is one of several places that claims to be the birthplace of Homer. It's also claimed that this particular rock is a place where Homer recited his poetry there. That's almost certainly a myth. It's not even definitively proven that Homer was a single individual, but the local tradition says that he was born on Chios. There's a lot of conflict between the ancient sources as to who he really was, and so it's kind of hard to determine exactly what happened all those thousands of years ago. But it is kind of fun to visit this rock and imagine that Homer was a particular person who recited his works orally in front of a crowd of students. And to try something completely different, this is a much more recent place, late medieval, probably 18th, 19th century village in the hills above the northeastern coast. One of the things that I enjoyed most about Chios is just exploring in the mountains, because there are all kinds of little villages, many of which are still inhabited and a few of which are completely ruined. This one is called Kidianda, and there is nothing left but ruins, very atmospheric ruins up in the mountains, goats wandering around. And if you like ghost towns, it's a beautiful place to stroll and has a gorgeous view back east towards the sea. And you will very likely be the only people there. Here's a nice view back across in the distance. The land you can see way off in the distance, back up here, is the mainland of Turkey, the Turkish coast, which is about 10 miles away from here. And the land a little bit in front of it is a tiny island called Inuses, which is has only really one tiny little town, which you can see here, and a monastery. It makes a nice day trip from Chios. It's administratively considered part of Chios. But really, there's not much there except fishing boats and some little villages, and that's about it. You can stop at villages along the way, and most villages in Greece usually have what's called a platia, the central square. More often than not, they will have a huge plane tree like this one does. Plane trees are a European version, kind of related to sycamores. And there's usually a big one in the middle that gives shade to the square and the taverna. Often there's a fountain. And you can stop and have a drink and a snack and pass the time with the locals who are usually very friendly and happy to have you stop in. This is a pretty view of the northeastern coast. If you've attended any of my programs before, you know I love goats. I'm a huge fan of goats, and Chios has plenty of them. They all are alternatively lazy and sensibly sit in the shade when they can, or also very industrious when they're hungry. You can see on the right how sure-footed they are. They can climb up almost vertical walls. And I ran into this nice herd of goats in the middle of nowhere. And I ended up in a nice chat with the goat herd on this dirt road, um, who kind of wondered what on earth we were doing there because there weren't very many tourists in that area and definitely no tourists on the road we were on. So he was not only surprised that we were there, but he was surprised that I actually spoke enough Greek to have a conversation with him. And it was kind of fun to just chat with the locals about his goats and his life and where I was from and so forth. Here I am with my people. Even up higher in the mountains, we're looking. This is almost the same view we had before, but at a much higher elevation. So you can see the island I was just talking about, which is kind of low lying, and right behind it is the Turkish coast, the Turkish mainland. Much of the northern part of the island, we're kind of going counterclockwise up to the northeastern part, especially in the higher elevations, is very barren, very rocky, very little in the way of trees or other vegetation. And all around the coast, you can see one up here kind of hiding in the corner. The Genoese, when they were in the Middle Ages, when they controlled the island, built dozens of watchtowers all the way around the island for protection. And many of them still exist. Some are in good condition and some aren't. But they are mostly sprinkled around the coastline. Heading back towards the main town again, you can see the most developed part of the island is all along the west coast back towards the main town and the main harbor. There's a mountain is about maybe 1,200 feet high or so, and there's a fantastic switchback road that goes down the hillside with terrific views all the way down to the mostly developed east side. And you can see all the way to the main Chios town, which is where the central harbor is located. Here's the same view on a slightly sunnier day. All of my programs, I like to include a little bit about food. So, because that's one of the joys of traveling in Greece. So we stopped in a nice little seaside restaurant that had a view of the Turkish coast, not far from where we were staying. So here's some pastitsio, which is good Greek comfort food. It's kind of like basically like Greek lasagna. Layers of pasta and beef with bechamel sauce baked over the top, and a nice beef stew with delicious fries. Greek French fries are, I think, the best in the world because if they're done right, they make them with olive oil and sea salt and oregano. They're absolutely delicious if they're done nice and crispy. Another delicious food, which I like to make at home because it's very easy, are these beans called gigantes. These are giant beans. They don't really exist in this country, but the closest thing that you could get is butter beans. I think we call them here in the US, but they're very, very large, the largest size bean. In import stores, if you have any Greek import shops near you, you can buy actual gigantes from Greece. And they're just stewed. And like many country recipes, there's a million different versions depending on what you want to put in it. You can use meat or not, but it's basically a stew with beans and vegetables, garlic, olive oil, onion, sometimes sausage, and it's a very nice, hearty kind of peasant meal. We're now going the opposite direction down the southeast coast. This is a nice little village we stopped at on the way called Armolia. We'll come back here later for a little bit more. We stopped there for breakfast. But we were heading to the southeast coast, which is a very craggy corner of the island. You can see the big cliffs. And the reason we were heading there is to climb up a mountain to see one of the major archaeological sites of the island called Emporios, which has ruins that date as far back as the 8th century BC. And I think when we were there was maybe one other couple, but we basically had the site completely to ourselves. It's way high up on a mountain with fantastic views, and the ruins are very impressive. There's more than 50, the foundations of more than 50 homes and shops that were part of the settlement, as well as an acropolis way up high that had the more official public and spiritual buildings, including the palace and a temple to Athena, the goddess Athena. And like I said, unlike many of the other popular ancient archaeological sites in Greece, if you go here, you will very likely be among the only people there. In addition to the historic, the ruins and the history of the place, there's spectacular views to the southernmost tip of the island, which you can see way off in the distance, and some really nice beaches looking straight down to the beautiful blue Aegean Sea. And looking back north, this is the highest point of the mountain on which the ruins are, which is about 600 feet high, but it seems higher because it's literally next to the ocean. So it just drops down several hundred feet to the water. And there's some unusual rock formations like this one. And nearby, if you explore that little corner of the island, there's a marvelous black pebble beach, which is worth a stroll or a swim if the water's right, with nothing but these beautiful pebble beaches. The Aegean has a mix of sand beaches and pebble beaches, depending on the geology of the island. Pebble beaches are much more common there than sand beaches in a lot of places, and black pebble beaches are not too common. So this one is particularly well known for that. And in fact, if you clamber over the rocks, there's a second hidden beach behind it. This is called Paralia Foci, which also has black pebbles, and virtually no visitors. Have it all to yourself. Also in this corner of the island, we drove almost as far south as you can go. The village of Dotia, which is up in the hills, has this nice ruined medieval tower from the Genoese period. But the big thing to see in the southern part of the island is the mastiha growing region and what they call the mastiha-choria. The mastiha-choria are the villages connected with the growing of mastiha. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it's one of the reasons why Chios is famous today and throughout most of its history. There are several towns worth visiting in this area, and probably the best known is called Pyrgi, which is the seat of the area and has about 1,000 people. And it's known for its incredible black and white geometric decorations on almost all of the buildings. It's a very old town, established in the 10th century, and fortunately was not terribly damaged in the 1881 earthquake. So it retains a lot of its medieval style, which is very lucky given how beautiful it is. The designs that you see are called xista, which literally means scratched in Greek. And what it is a gray undercoat with white plaster over it, and then artisans scrape away some of the white coating to expose the gray underneath in mostly geometric patterns, although you'll see a lot of designs that have animals plants and things like that, but most of the designs are geometric. And I would say probably at least 4 out of 5 buildings, if not more, in this village have some amount of these designs. It's really incredible because um, you are literally walking down the street and seeing nothing but these designs on virtually every building you look at. It's thought that the designs are supposed to imitate the people would have hung Turkish style kilim rugs, which have similar designs over the balconies. And in they think, I don't know if this is actually true or not, but the designs are supposed to sort of imitate the designs that would have been in a Turkish style carpet or blanket. But it's fascinating to walk around this town. Most of the oldest designs at this point date only from the mid 19th century, but they are still done today. And there are still artisans that know how to do this. And in the center of the village, there's a big main square with lots of cafes and uh, restaurants around it. And this is the main church to the Virgin. But the whole town is full of narrow little streets, many of which are covered with arches, little alleyways. And you may come upon this church, this Byzantine church on the right, called the Church of the Holy Apostles, which is extremely old from the 14th century, a very typical Byzantine church, with miraculous original frescoes on the interior that are in superb condition. It's unknown why this particular village, Pyrgi, is the only village anywhere in this area that has these designs. Why it didn't spread to other villages, no one really knows. But Pyrgi is the place where they all are. And the other interesting thing about these villages, Pyrgi being a good example, is that they are in the Aegean, in all of the Aegean islands, they are among the only walled villages. They are very early villages, and they were completely surrounded by medieval fortification walls, which is pretty unusual in the Aegean for villages of that time period. Nowadays, they are much more relaxed. They're not worried about pirates. They're more worried about tourism and earthquakes. So this is much more of what you will see in the street life there. Little dried tomatoes hanging outside one of the houses, and a couple more views of that central main square. The church has a beautiful terrace quite up high over the central square, so it has a nice view. And a lot of the cafes and restaurants and tavernas around the square have the designs in archways over them to keep people cool. If you happen to be on Chios and aren't doing your own touring, there are definitely tours that you can take, a little bus tour or something that will take you to some of the most famous villages around the island, and these are certainly the most popular. This is another one only a few kilometers to the west called Olympi, another one which was completely walled and still is. And even more well known is Mesta, which is a 12th century medieval town that's, because of the walls and the narrowness of the streets, it's almost completely pedestrianized. So it really feels like you're going back in time because there's almost no vehicles in it. It's a joy to walk through. Today, it only has about 300 people. The original walls were fortified by strengthened by the Genoese in the 14th century, and you can still see those walls today, the external walls all around the outside of the town. So you park outside and then stroll around the narrow alleyways. And there is a huge church in the middle. This is called the Church of the Archangels Michael and Gabriel, which was a more recent church. It was built at the end of the 18th century. But it's fun to just kind of get lost in the alleyways. It's These aren't big towns, so you're not going to really get lost. You're eventually going to come out somewhere where you know. There are lots of little completely quiet and abandoned alleyways. There are others that are full of restaurants that spill out into the street where people are having dinner, and lots of beautiful little details to enjoy, architectural details on all the buildings. Nearby on the west coast, not very far from Mesta, is the old port of Mesta, which is Mesta itself is a few miles inland, but it had a port to export the mastica, which we're going to talk about shortly. And here you can actually see all what the land that you see in the back is the curving west coast of the island, going all the way up uh, north and west. And on that side of the island, there are plenty of isolated villages to explore um, with very little tourism. Most of these villages may have a cafe, a taverna, just some cute little streets to wander around, and not much else. Most of them are nestled in small valleys for protection. Um, and that's true of many places in Greece because the oldest villages in Greece were not built on the coast as they are today, because back in those days, people were worried about piracy. So it was foolish to build your village right on the coast where you were easily accessible to bad weather, storms, and piracy. So most of the villages were built up in the mountains. Um, and it wasn't until the last century or so, when tourism became more of a thing, that newer villages start to be developed on the beaches because it's a very different lifestyle now. Um, I can't even remember the name of this village. I just remember it had some beautiful little alleyways. And one of my favorite sites on the island, and one of the biggest to see, one of like the top 10 things on to do on Chios, is the deserted medieval tower village called Anavatos. Hmm. Excuse me, I needed some coffee. Um, Anavatos, the name is related to uh, the verb to climb up. And you can see why, because it's perched about 1,500 feet up on this narrow rock outcrop, and it spills down the side. It was a very important fortress overlooking the west side of the island and was very important during the fight for independence from the Ottomans in the 1820s. But it suffered terribly in the war and during the massacre in 1822, as well as also the 1881 earthquake. So it really kind of disappeared from the map at that point and was largely abandoned. So now it's an atmospheric ruin, but they are trying to restore it as a historic site. So parts of it are gradually being rebuilt and restored, but you can clamber around the foundations and the rocks, particularly if you aren't afraid of heights and cliffs. And you will be rewarded at the top with unbelievable views in all basically 360-degree directions. And you can clearly see why this was a location chosen for protection. It's not on the coast, it's near the coast, but it is pretty much on almost, well, three and a half sides. It's almost completely inaccessible. Um, um, Unlike the United States, where they would have all kinds of barriers, Greece doesn't care if you climb all over the rocks and fall down and die. So as long as you're sensible and you're there, they don't mind if you explore on your own and stand on the edge of a dangerous cliff. But it is worthwhile to be a little bit careful. And I would also, if you go here, I would recommend going late in the day if you can, because the afternoon light, as the sun goes down in the west, is particularly beautiful. It lights up the ruins, it lights up the cliffs, and the setting sun is just magical on this side of the island at that time of day. back in town for dinner. Uh, the place we just were, that clifftop ruin, is really only about 30 minutes all the way back to Chios. Chios is not that big an island, and the roads are perfectly good. So with a car, you can visit any place on the island within an hour, hour and a half drive, um, particularly if you're based in the center. So for dinner that night, we had some Greek comfort food. This is another delicious stew, and some stuffed zucchinis in an egg lemon sauce. And of course, Retsino, which is the resin-based wine, which is a favorite of mine. Um, Another top 10 site to see, Chios is fortunate to host one of Greece's 19 UNESCO World Heritage Sites called Nea Moni, which literally means new monastery, although it's actually from the 11th century, so not new by our standards. But it was built by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine, not the Constantine. This is another Constantine. There were lots of them. And at its height, this monastery had about 800 monks living there. Um, and of course, during the 1822 massacre by the Ottomans, a number of locals sought refuge in the monastery. It's way up in the hills, and it's has fortification walls all the way around it. So about 2,000 people tried to hide up here away from the massacre, but they were unsuccessful because the Ottomans attacked anyway, and most of them were either killed or burned alive in the buildings. That and the monastery a few decades later meant that that and the earthquake a few decades later meant that the monastery never really regained its past glory from centuries past. So in 1952, it was converted from a monastery to a nunnery, and today there's only a handful of nuns. I think maybe four or five nuns that still live there, which is true of many of the historic monasteries throughout Greece. But the complex is just architecturally incredible. It's one of the most important religious monuments in all of the Aegean. There are three churches, including the main one, which you can see here in these images, as well as a number of other buildings that are used for dormitories and dining halls. But inside the main church, there are some incredible mosaics. These are mosaics, not painted frescoes. So this is actually gold and pieces of stone and glass rather than paint. And they're in remarkably good condition for their age. And as I mentioned, the entire complex is surrounded by protective walls with towers. And it's still an active archaeological site. So they are still doing digging there and still excavating parts of the complex that were used as kitchens and cells for the monks and so forth. They're continually learning more and more. This is a wooden plank, and I'm forgetting the Greek term for it, but it's very typical of the Eastern Church, Orthodox Church all over the Balkan area and Eastern Europe. And it hangs from ropes or chains, and it was struck to summon the monks to prayer at different times of the day. What it says, carved into it, it says "Ego ime to phostisois," which is "I am the light of the world," Greek. And this monastery was big enough and important enough that it even had a substantial cistern, pretty large for a complex its size, to store water. And unlike many of the monasteries where you'll see the bones of former monks, these are actually not monks. These are the remains of the Chians who died in the massacre at the monastery. So this is a slightly different kind of macabre look at history. The massacre is still probably the defining historical moment in all of Chios' long history. Um, but another aspect to visiting the monastery, which is not terribly far, it's barely half an hour's drive from the main town up in the hills, it's pretty much in the dead center of the island, but it has a glorious view in all directions. Particularly here, we're looking east through some of the hills back in the direction towards Turkey and the main town. And you can drive up the hillside to get a much better view looking down, a great view on the entire complex. So you can clearly see how it's arranged with the different churches, the other buildings that were used for dormitories, and the other churches, and also the protective walls that completely surround the complex and the towers that were built as well. This was a castle essentially, as well as a religious place. And built above it, on higher up the mountain, is another and much newer monastery of the Holy Fathers, very different in style, mostly built in the 19th century, so much more recent. And it has a whole long row of buildings built along the ridge, right above that earlier monastery. Um, it's not as easily visited, mainly because there's only two remaining monks. So whether you're lucky enough to get in or not kind of depends on whether you can rouse them. We knocked on the door, and fortunately, one of the monks let us in. And we didn't get to see much of the complex, but he at least let us in to see the very interesting underground cave chapel, which is built right into the rock. Um, and along another part of the coast, this is back down on the southern coast, some more typical landscape views with yet another Genoese watchtower. You can see them all the way around the island. There's another one. Not surprisingly, most of them are kind of near the sea. And nowadays, they're often in very beautiful spots where there are little coves and beaches with almost nobody there. So if you like deserted beaches, this is a great island for you. Chios, I really found, particularly if you're not there during the summer, when even Chios gets a little bit more touristy, it really is picture postcard Greece without all of the traffic and the tourists. But back to, I talked about Mastiha and the Mastiha villages. And so I want to go into that in a little bit more detail because it's one of the most important reasons why people visit the island, because it really is unique to the island. The mastiha that we've already seen, Mesta, Pirgi, Olympi, and a few others, are all in the southern part of the island, which is the center of mastiha production. There's also a very nice museum from which this photograph is taken looking back to Pirgi. This is the museum. It's a recently built museum, and it talks all about mastiha production. In English, it's known as mastic, and it's a dried resin which comes from the trees that you can see here. Kind of a scrubby little tree, not very tall, and it's produced pretty much exclusively on Chios, and not even all of Chios. Really, only the southern part of the island is suitable for the cultivation of these trees. There's a tiny amount grown on mainland Turkey nearby, but very little. So the very well done museum looks out over a mastic grove, and the museum is big and fascinating. They have all these great exhibits on the history of mastica, how it's cultivated, how it's produced, and the kinds of products that it's turned into. Not to mention a really great shop if you want to buy all kinds of mastica products. This is a model of one of the walled mastiha villages when it would have originally been built in medieval times. Chios was very valuable throughout all of the island's history for many of its rulers because of the economic benefit of mastic trade to the Sultan in Constantinople, Through the Byzantine Empire, the Genoese used it. It was an extremely valuable commodity that was essentially literally worth its weight in gold. Um, it's You can chew it as like gum. It's used as a digestive. In fact, it's where we get the word masticate from. Mastic, our word, which means to chew, actually comes from mastiha. The tree itself is technically called Pistachia lentiscus. And these days, there's about 20,000 acres of them in southern Chios. The white powder that you see under the trees is calcium carbonate that is actually put there by people. It's not something that comes from the tree. It's an inert powder that they use basically to make it easier to see and collect the droplets of resin when they dry and they fall off of the tree. And it makes it easier to see them, and it also keeps them from getting dirty on the ground because they need to be cleaned during their production. The droplets of resin are also known as poetically as the tears of Chios. And there are hundreds of people in the area who are still involved in the cultivation and processing of mastic, which is very labor intensive. A lot of it is still done by hand. Here's an exhibit in the museum that shows a local actually taking these individual little dried bits of resin. They have to be sifted and cleaned. On the right, you can see some of my own mastica. You can buy it in the airport. You can buy it in Chios, but you can buy it you can even buy it online if you don't have easy access to an import shop. And certainly, if you're ever in Greece, almost any airport in Greece sells little mastica packets that you can buy. The little box on the left includes the dried resin chunks. In the middle is almost more like a spreadable mastica, which you can use in cooking. And it's also very popularly made into a liqueur, which is quite delicious, which you can drink as a digestive. The taste it's hard to describe. It's piney, it's aromatic, it's herbal. But if I try to tell you what it's like, it's not really like anything else. It is definitely herbal and piney, but it's not like ouzo. It's not like the kind of licorice anise flavor of ouzo. Um, it's completely unique. It's not like any other flavor, and it's used now in. You can use it for cooking. I make a really good mastica cheesecake. Um, it's used in liquor, like you can see here in this photo. They use it in beauty products like um, soaps and perfumes and so forth. There's also mastica ice cream. Um, and like many other European products, it has now local protection from the European Union so that true mastica must be grown according to certain production values in this particular part of Chios Island. So you don't necessarily have to go to Chios to get a chance to taste it, but if you see it in any shops, um, or if you happen to be in any other part of Greece, like the Athens airport, you can certainly find mastica products to buy and bring home. Here, just to give you a little bit more close-up view, you can see the resin um, seeping out of the bark through the cuts that they make in the bark that allows it to ooze out, and then gradually it hardens and falls to the ground. You can see why they're called tears. And as I said, it's always throughout history. It's one of the reasons why Chios has been an incredibly valuable island economically for all of the people who ruled it. And in fact, even during the Ottoman massacre in the 1820s, they largely spared the mastic growing region because the Sultan wanted to keep the mastic production going because mastic was a very important crop, and he wanted it for himself as well. Here's another break for food. A delicious choriatiki salata, the village salad that in Greece has no lettuce, It's always served with a huge chunk of feta or other local cheese. This actually isn't feta on top. This is a similar kind of cheese, but it's a particular kind made only on Chios. Um, and some fried anchovies, which are kind of like eating deep fried anchovies, like eating crispy shrimp. I noticed I love bad translations on menus, and I noticed they had baby shark. I will not sing the baby shark song because I know that will mean it'll be in your head for the rest of the day. Um, but actually, I discovered that Galeos tiganitos doesn't actually mean baby shark. Galeos is a kind of shark that lives in the Mediterranean, and they do eat it as a food fish, but it's not baby. So I'm not sure why it was translated as baby shark. And to finish up, I'm going to take you around the northern part of the island, the northwestern corner, which is very rarely visited and has not very much except very beautiful scenery and isolated villages. This is called Volissos, which is on a hill very close to the sea. Again, a village that was built near the sea for protective reasons, but not on the sea. So it's about 250 meters up, and it was started in the 11th century. Um, and they built this big castle to protect it, which you can climb up to. The town is very pleasant to walk through, and it's a good base. If you wanted to stay in this part and explore the island, they do have some nice guest houses and a few tavernas. A very quiet corner of the island. Here's a pretty chapel looking out over the sea. And here you can see a better view looking west from the castle, looking down the whole west coast of the island, all the way to it kind of is a sort of C-shaped curve to the west coast of the island. Um, Another little village not too far to the north. I don't even remember the name. And here we are at the top of the castle, just enjoying the view, which includes a nice view back down to the center of town with all of its pretty narrow little streets that you can explore and some other churches. A windmill just below the castle ruins. That little town that you could just see a little bit to the north. Oh, I guess I do remember the name. It's called Piramas, which is a minuscule little village, but for some reason had this enormous church in it. I don't know why this tiny village merited such a incredibly large church. And as you go up the coast, you can actually see a very good view of the island of Sara, which is about 12 miles to the west. Administratively, it's part of the island of Chios, but much smaller. It only has about 500 people. Another of the villages looking towards Sara off in the distance. Back in the old days, Sara had about several thousand people at the time of Greek independence at the beginning of the 19th century. And it had a huge influx of refugees, about 20,000 or so, many of whom came from Chios after the massacre, and also other parts of the Aegean that were rising up and being attacked by the Ottomans. So a lot of people managed to escape to Sara, but unfortunately, that didn't last very long because the Turks invaded there a couple of years later, and the Greeks held out for quite a while, but pulled themselves up and ended up blowing themselves up rather than being taken alive as basically kidnapped into slavery. So they blew themselves up, killing thousands of Greeks and also killing thousands of the Turks who were trying to take them. The very few who remained were either killed or sold into slavery. And after that, the island really ended up disappearing into obscurity. So it's now a very sleepy little island with only a few hundred people on it, and it's mostly just a fishing place. the wind turbines that you see in front, there are quite a few of them on that coast of Chios. The Aegean islands get a lot of wind, so wind power is a very important part of the Greek energy um, uh, system. In fact, about 20% of the electricity demand in Greece is generated from wind. And in fact, I read recently that Greece is now seventh in the world in renewable energy, in the renewable energy sector for power. In other words, they get their electricity, about 36% of the electricity used in Greece comes from renewable sources, which places them seventh in the world. Most of that comes from solar. Obviously, Greece gets a lot of sun, and also from wind power, because Greece gets a lot of wind. Um, a number of other villages whose names I can't remember, but this one I do remember. This is Ios Galas, a tiny little church built into a cliff, and it gets its name from the fact that behind it, into the cliff, is a cave. And the water in that cave, the water that comes out of the spring in that cave, is very milky because of the minerals in it. So the church is named Iogalas, which refers to milk, the Greek word for milk. Unfortunately, the church was closed when we were there, but you can still wander around the area, and it's a very peaceful spot. If you want, the village that it's closest to is at the top of the mountain, so you can climb the stairs if you feel like it up to the little village at the top. But the valley where the church is very pretty, shaded, has some beautiful wildflowers, and a very peaceful little stream running through it. As you reach the very northern part of Chios, to the north, you will see the third largest island in Greece. That's Lesbos, which is about 20 miles away. And if the air is clear, which we were lucky to have it, you can see Lesbos. A number of additional little villages that I couldn't possibly remember the name of. But this is one of the enjoyable parts of just exploring this part of the island, because you just keep stumbling on these beautiful vistas. There are a lot of valleys in this part of the island, very deep valleys, because it's very barren here in the north. And there are some wonderful hikes, although they tend to be very exposed because there's a lack of vegetation unless you're way down in the bottom of the valleys. In fact, the plateau at the top is extremely barren and rocky, with almost no trees and just this incredible rocky terrain. I would say you can probably drive around the entire island in one day. It's not really that big. But we were there for, like I said, we were there for about 5 days, and I think that's a good amount of time to see all of the main sites of the island. If you wanted to just do nothing for a few days and relax on the beach, you might want to add a couple of days too. Here we are back in Chios town, looking over at the Turkish coast at dinner time. And if you look south, you can see yet another island in that part of the area. That's about 20 miles to the south, and that's called Ikaria, which gets its name from Icarus. I'm sure you've heard of Daedalus and Icarus, who supposedly they were the ones who made wings out of feathers and wax, and Icarus was the sun, and Daedalus, his father, told him, "Don't fly too close to the sun." And of course, being young and impetuous, he did fly too close to the sun. The wax melted, and he fell into the sea. And supposedly, he fell into the sea here, and the island is now named because of him. Although it's much more famous these days because Ikaria is one of what they call the blue zones. And the people on that island are known for having a particularly good diet, where they all live to well over 100 years old. And so everybody's trying to find out, how can we eat like the Icarians and live to 100? I've yet to visit Ikaria, but I've heard it's beautiful, and it's definitely on my list. Um, And back to the main town where we started in the beginning. Like I said, I wouldn't say it's one of the most stunning of the Greek island towns, but it's still a very pleasant place with its fortress. I don't think I mentioned it has a very nice archaeological museum with artifacts from the history of the island, and it has this really nice waterfront that you can just stroll along and look at the boats, um, look at the harbor. There's a lot of restaurants all the way and bars all the way along the promenade where you can get delicious things like wine from Chios. This is a good eggplant salad. Um, souvlaki. This is a uvetsi, which is kind of a baked casserole with lots of melted cheese on the top and meat and vegetables inside. Um, and this is a grilled cheese. Um, Greeks do that with a lot of different cheeses where they actually take a big slab of cheese and just grill it on the grill. If it's a hard enough cheese, um, it holds its shape and you can eat it with sometimes with honey, sometimes with vinegar, other different kinds of sauces. And it makes a delicious appetizer. You're also very likely to have guests, whether you like it or not during dinner. I was joined by Kostas, the cat, who was very friendly and remarkably not interested in my dinner. He just wanted a place to sit. So he curled up on my lap for most of the dinner. And afterwards, we strolled along. They do light up all the palm trees in the buildings at night, which is nice. So you can stroll and see the boats, enjoy the lights, stop and have a coffee or a after dinner drink. If you're filthy rich, of course, you can do this from your yacht. And as we left the island, this is one last view from the plane. As we leave, you can see the harbor and all the suburban development right around the main town. Chios is probably most easily reached by plane. From Athens, it's barely an hour. There's almost no islands in the Aegean that are more than an hour or an hour and 15 minutes from Athens, and the flights are rarely more than $100 round trip. So depending on how far you're going, plane might be the easiest way to get there. There are also obviously ferries, but the ferries tend to take longer. So it kind of depends on your schedule and how much time you have and whether you like boats or not. Chios is far enough away from Athens that I think plane is probably easier just because it's fast and cheap. So I will end the program there, and I will unshare my screen and go back to the questions and make sure we can answer any of the questions that people might have. Let me do, let's see. Oh, there's a whole bunch. Let's see. Let me do the chat first, and then I'll do the Q&A. According to your experience, to believe that it would be essential to learn some Greek phrases in order to understand them better. My theory of travel, no matter where you're going, is I think it is good for you and it is good manners, I think, to make an attempt anytime you go to a foreign country to learn a few basic phrases. It doesn't take that long. Nobody expects you to be fluent, but the fact that you have learned how to say good morning, good evening, please, thank you, where's the bathroom? Right? And my favorite, your country, your village, your house, your neighborhood, whatever, is beautiful. People love to be complimented on where they live. People are proud of where they are. And if you end up in a conversation with a local, being able to say, I think the place that you live is beautiful, is a great way to break down barriers. So even if you only learn a few of those phrases in any language, write them down on a little scrap card or have them on an app on your phone. You can do it. Having said that, Greek is a difficult language, and no one would expect you to be speaking fluent Greek there, and everyone knows English. In fact, Greece has one of the highest penetrations of English language speakers of all of Europe, and that's because it's so visited by tourists. So any place that you go, except little villages in the middle of nowhere, you're bound to meet somebody who knows at least enough English to be able to get by. Um, let's see what else. Let's see, what year were I? What year was I there? This was not last fall, but the fall before. Wait a minute, November? It was either no. I think this was this past November. Yeah, it was just this past November we were there. Um, don't the stones get disturbed and lose their? Oh, you're talking about the beautiful black and white mosaic stones. No, they don't get disturbed because they are actually in mortar. They're stuck permanently in mortar, so they don't move when you walk on them. The online tours, yes. In fact, I will make sure that Robert sends out a link. Um, Not all, but many. I would say at least 20 of my programs, including this one, once it's uploaded, are available on the Wakefield Library's YouTube channel. So I'll make sure that Robert sends you a link to that so you can watch um, other different programs that I have. How large an island is it? I would say it's probably, I don't remember the exact dimensions, but I would say, give or take, it's probably like twice the size of Martha's Vineyard, maybe. So it's you can easily, particularly since the main town is in the middle, you could drive around the whole island in one day if you absolutely had to. But I think it's easier to make little day trips for wherever you happen to be. And you could stay in more than one place, but you certainly didn't need to. We stayed in the guest house that we stayed in, which was very centrally located, and we just stayed there the whole time and took the car out for the day and came back. It was not hard to get around at all. Why does Greece have so many cats? Um, well, they breed like rabbits or cats, and people do keep cats as pets, although most of the cats that you see are strays. Although they are often strays that are fed by the locals. Um, so yeah, there's uh, much more so than dogs. Greece does not have anywhere near as many dogs running around, although they have some. But cats you will find everywhere in Greece. Um, did you take all of these photos? Yes, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed them. And yes, I took them all. I do have a fancy camera, but all the photos in this presentation were actually taken with my phone, believe it or not. Can you spell the name of the village? It's, I think in English, it is spelled Pirgi. Oh, I think, excuse me, I didn't send that to everybody. Send to everyone. There we go. It's called Pirgi, and because you're transliterating from Greek to English, sometimes it might be a Y, it sometimes might be an I, but it is the main town in the southern part of the island. And if you look at any um, guidebook to Chios, or if you Google top 10 things to see on Chios, Pirgi will be definitely one of the top things. Okay, so I guess that's did I get? Oh, I did miss a few. Um, what do most of the people living on the island do to earn a living? In most cases, on a lot of Greek islands, it's tourism. Tourism is a huge part. I want to say it's something like 30% of the total Greek economy now is tourism. Um, on Chios, mastiha is still a major crop simply because it's so unusual and so desired. That's a big part of Chios in particular, and fishing, certainly fishing is still a big thing. But hospitality and tourism is probably one of the biggest. My favorite wine. I don't know what my favorite wine is. Oh, unless you're talking about, I think I did mention Retsina, which I wouldn't say it's my favorite wine, but I enjoy it a lot. Retsina is a usually dry um, white wine in Greece that is made with um, pine resin. So it has a very piney flavor to it. You either like it or you don't. And some people, I love it. Um, some people think it tastes like turpentine, which it kind of does. It may be an acquired taste like a lot of different alcoholic beverages, but you can easily buy it here in the US. So, and it's pretty cheap. So give it a try sometime and you can decide whether you're one of the people who likes it or hates it. It's very refreshing. It goes great with lots of Greek food, very dry, and it has a unique flavor. Um, um, Someone asks about getting to Chios from Athens. Yeah, you definitely want to fly into Athens. And from there, if by plane, it's barely an hour from Athens to Chios on the plane. I'm not sure how long a ferry trip it is, or whether there's a direct ferry. My guess is you would probably have to switch somewhere. I doubt there is a ferry that goes all the way from Athens to Chios, so that would be a much longer trip. Um, so I think if I were doing it, I would recommend a flight just because it's so much easier and it's not really very expensive. Um, the Okinawa diet, somebody mentioned that. Yes, in regards to Ikaria, the island with that's known for its extremely old people, yes, it's similar. Uh, Obviously, the Okinawa diet has it's based on similar types of foods and types of nutrients. The Mediterranean diet is generally considered to be very healthy, and it's certainly delicious. And I think the Okinawa, my understanding, if I can remember, is that the Okinawa diet is another one of those what they call blue zones, where the particular foods that people eat are conducive um, to long life. So I think the actual Okinawa diet probably tastes very differently, but is considered to have similar benefits. Um, I think that's all the questions there. How do you say your home is beautiful in Greece? You could say, I like your home, latrevo, resi πολύ το σπίτι σου. You could say, το σπίτι σου είναι όμορφο, which means your house is beautiful. Now I'm going to take a quick look through the um, questions in the Q&A. Let's see. Are the mosaics Turkish influenced? I don't think so. That's a good question, and I don't really know the answer, but my travels in Turkey, I don't recall seeing them there. They are particularly connected with the Dodecanese Islands and some other islands um, in mostly in the Western, or I'm sorry, the Eastern Mediterranean. But I couldn't say that for sure. You mentioned goats and cats. Are there any other animals on the island? Um, uh, Depending on whether you mean domestic or wild animals, there's not a lot of big wild animals. They have foxes and rabbits and, the kind of small mammals, lizards, lots of bird life. Um, but for domesticated animals, there's a little bit in the way of cows and sheep, but mostly goats. Um, and the cats, like I said, are for the most part strays. What's a typical snack at the village centers? Oh, I could go on for hours about that. Greece is known for what they call mezedes in the plural, which is kind of like tapas, just lots of little things. It could be cheese, it could be little meatballs, it could be grape leaves, small snacks that you can eat. Although during the day, the biggest meal that the Greeks eat, like a lot of Europeans, particularly in Southern Europe, the biggest meal is actually lunchtime, kind of late lunch compared to our lunch here in the U.S. And they would have a large meal then. and then probably something smaller at night. I don't see a lot of cell phone towers in your photos. That's because I don't take photos of cell phone towers. They're ugly. They do exist. And uh, the technology situation on most of the islands I've been to has been fine. And surprisingly, even in islands where I didn't expect it to be good, I had cell phone service without any difficulty, and GPS service without difficulty. That depends probably on your plan and which carrier you use. But yeah, it's fine. Never really had any problem. Someone asks about the beaches, and I think I did mention earlier there are sandy beaches in the Aegean, but they are in the minority. Um, Most of the Greek beaches in the islands tend to be the pebbly kind. How much English is spoken? I think I talked about that already. It's pretty widely spoken, at least enough for a tourist to get by. Um, Tiny, tiny little villages, maybe not, but usually not a problem. Um, do the small villages take credit cards? How did you pay? Um, you can get away with almost anywhere using a credit card. Um, I can't believe how many places I've been, even in the middle of nowhere in Greece, a tiny little store that will take a credit card for a €3 purchase. Um, they use them everywhere. There are times in some places where you might get someone who says, "Oh, I'm sorry, today we can't take a credit card because our machine is broken." And that's probably not because the machine is actually broken. It's because they may have to pay a fee for credit card usage. So they'll say, "Oh, we're really sorry, we have to take cash today." Um, so I would always be prepared to have some cash with you. But the last couple of times I've been in Greece, I always take some spare cash with me, and I don't think I used cash anywhere. You don't even use it to pay um, tolls on the highway. You can just tap your card and off you go. So credit cards are probably fine. Make sure you alert your credit card company before you leave that you're traveling somewhere. And you're almost always going to be able to use a card, certainly in restaurants and shops and hotels and places like that. Um, Take some cash just to have as a backup. And someone asked about the trees, the skinny trees. Yes, those are cypresses, which are very common in the Mediterranean. What did islanders use for cooking fuel with so few trees? Um, some of it, well, if you're talking about now, obviously they're using modern fuel. Back in the old days, they probably would have used whatever wood there was, which may be an explanation why there's not a lot of trees now. And also, they would have used um, basically animal excrement, which, if you dry it and put it into little bricks, is very useful for fuel. Um, what is mastic used for? I think I covered that, but just as a reminder, it's the main thing it's used for is either cooking, liquor, um, beauty products, candies, ice cream. It's a flavoring, so it's used in a lot of things where you want a flavor or an aroma. Um, does each village have a school? No, definitely not. Larger ones might have a school, but in many cases, there will be a bus that takes the kids to whatever larger village nearby has a school. Main source of income, again, tourism by far. Uh, on the photo with the wind turbines, we see rocks in the sea, and it looks like it's not very deep on that part. It depends, but in general, the Aegean is actually extremely deep. Um, there are places in the Aegean that are unbelievably deep when you see how big the sea is. Um, and that's one of the reasons why wind turbines tend to be built on shore rather than offshore, because building wind turbines in deep water is a very different prospect from building them in shallow water. So um, I guess that answers the question. You'll sometimes see rocks not far away just because there are all kinds of different undersea things. But if you look at a topographic view of the under the water view um, of the Mediterranean, it's very close to the coastline. It'll drop off to several hundred or even several thousand feet deep, very close to the coast. It's very different here in New England. And I think the last question is, may we request a recording? Yes, the program has been recorded, and Robert is going to send out a follow-up email, which will include a link to the presentation. And as I mentioned, I will also have Robert include my email. So if you have any further questions, you're welcome to contact me individually, and also a link to the YouTube page where other programs are listed so you can watch them at your leisure. And I think the next time, I'm sure Robert will probably include this in his message as well. I know I'm doing a program on two other Greek islands, Rhodes and Simi, which are completely different from the one we just saw today. And I believe I forget the exact date, but I know it's towards the end of August. So he can include the details on that as well if you're interested in going to yet another Greek island.
Yeah, that's going to be Tuesday, August 27th at 10:30 Eastern. Folks, is there a more thorough armchair travel presenter than Jeff? Let's give Jeff a big virtual round of applause for a great job.
I hope you enjoyed it.
No, absolutely. I think everyone did. I will, as Jeff said, look for that follow-up email from me later today, link to a feedback survey, link to the recording, information about other upcoming virtual armchair travel presentations, info on our adult summer reading challenge, which is completely virtual. And yes, I will include Jeff's email in case folks want to follow up with one-on-one questions. And I will also include the Wakefield YouTube channel link so you can watch some of his past presentations. So with that, Jeff, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me back.
Enjoy your time in Greece this summer, and we'll see you in about 6 weeks or so.
Okay.
All right.
Have a good rest of your summer, everyone.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.